Hi, hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to another edition of A+D Mondays. My name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design here at UC Berkeley, and it's a thrill to welcome you to another gathering around the theme of gathering, around the theme of public reassembly across politics, across disciplines, and across a range of sectors in our educational and our regional ecology. This series, as I think many of you know, but not everyone knows, is produced by the Arts and Design Initiative, and like everything we do at the Arts and Design Initiative, it is co-curated and co-conceived with a range of departments, centers, student clubs, museums, presenting organizations that represent the vast network of our creative culture at UC Berkeley. Tonight is no exception. It is also one of those programs, this is one of many programs where the funds that we bring help to fortify all of those different centers and departments so that they can bring out and host a dream team of visitors and speakers and artist designers, the kinds of people and ideas that compel our students and compel our faculty here at UC Berkeley. A privilege to do this work, and I want to encourage you all to go to learn more at our website, artsdesign.berkeley.edu, artsdesign.berkeley.edu. In order to learn more, sign up for the newsletter. And of course, if you are ever inclined to help us continue this kind of cutting-edge programming, and make sure it's free and open to the public and our students, we welcome any kind of fortification for that effort as well. It's one of those things about being the defunded public university, but maintaining our public values, right? Okay. All right. Tonight is one of those nights where we are particularly thrilled to continue a conversation about assembly across disciplines here by welcoming the Greater Good Science Center into our creative orbit, and to do so in collaboration with our regional partners, the Bay Area Science Festival, who is here tonight, as well as our campus partners, in particular Science at Cal, and our student-sponsoring club, the Cognitive Sciences Student Association. So hands for that, bring your hands together for those groups. It's a really big week, a really big couple of weeks for science in our region right now. It should be always a big week for science. We want to be sure that it continues that way. But this is a particular week that whether I've been finding myself welcoming Science Gallery International into my co-taught course, or this weekend unveiling a new public art piece in celebration of gene editing and genomics at the Genomics Institute on Friday, or yesterday in a wonderful symposium sponsored by the Vision Plus Light Gallery, gathering around art and science. It's just a time when really interesting conversations are happening about collaborations and connections across arts fields and science fields. What happens when these fields work together in mutual collaboration, in catalytic collaboration that galvanize and challenge each other? It's been a time that we've been thinking about it throughout the week, and we're going to continue to do so tonight. Indeed, it's really interesting to think about what happens when these fields, which are occupied by people who have tremendous and relentless, impatient curiosity for transforming the world, start to think about reimagining it together. And a thrill especially to welcome a figure who has been so key to that reimagining. Dacher Keltner is somebody whose research on the science of emotions has indeed been positively catalytic for many of us, in part for how it helps us to recognize the human capacities for transformations. As many of you know, Keltner will be someone who tells you that he thinks that compassion just might be the most powerful idea built into human design. Keltner will also help you think about why we feel awe and why it's important that we do so. He helps us think more about the forms and formats that will inspire altruism, that create possibilities for empathy, and that also create unexpected but necessary conditions for acts of human kindness. Dacher Keltner is a UC Berkeley faculty member in the Department of Psychology, director of the Berkeley Social Interaction Lab, and of course the founder and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center. His research has been widely circulated in all kinds of psychology journals and peer-reviewed venues, but more recently Dacher has been translating his scientific work into creative projects around the world. He was, for instance, a scientific consultant on Pixar's film Inside Out. For the last 3 years, he's worked with Facebook engineers and designers to make their site more kind, as well as with Google on projects exploring altruism and emotions. He was, of course, a featured figure in the documentary film I Am. Dacher's work across creative fields, it seems to me, are just a brilliant example of the kind of cross-sector collaborations we want to cultivate and to feature throughout the Arts and Design Initiative at UC Berkeley. And indeed, we also happen to think that times like these need more opportunities to think about optimism, to cultivate it, and think about wellness and care. Indeed, in Dacher Keltner's world, care emerges as a deep form of creativity. Creativity as a very deep form of care. And I think we'll hear more about the connection tonight after you help me welcome Dacher Keltner to the stage.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Wow. Let's get these slides up. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see my beloved graduate students and many of my beloved undergraduates and best friends and family members and lots of familiar faces from the Berkeley times here, and even my teenage daughter is here. So that has made me doubly nervous. So hopefully I'll live up to Shannon's billing. That was really amazing. So the title of my talk is The Art of Emotions, Emotions in Art from Pixar Film. And then Shannon challenged me to think about the Empathetic Museum and just thinking about what do museums represent today? What do assemblies like this represent today? I think they're more vital than ever before, in particular in the interdisciplinary scope. So I'll be engaging in a little bit of speculation about that. So tonight's talk is, in a way, an answer to this question. And I'm going to tell 4 different stories that are an answer to this question, which is, how might the design of the nervous system, and in particular human emotion, inform today's institutions, be it what we do in the outside, what we do in schools, or what we do in our prisons and in our museums. I approach the human condition and the study of human emotion from an evolutionary perspective, and I think that you're going to see this run through this talk tonight. And I think that the science of emotion, which has been hard at work for the past 25 years, tells us some really important things that will kind of guide these interesting stories that I'm going to tell you about as I ventured outside of the lab and into interesting places like Facebook and Pixar. Emotions really are the stories of our social living. They are the great narrative structures of what life is like. They really are about the more meaningful dimensions to human life. Given that, emotions are, as Jean-Paul Sartre talked about, they are these magical transformations. They, in a split second, in an evanescent fashion, can transform how you think about the past, what you deem to be right and wrong, what you think about the future. They are the lens through which we see the world. We've also learned, and you're going to see a little bit of artistic evidence of this as we move to Inside Out, is that emotions also, as crafted by human evolution, are really the structures of our great social interactions. It's hard to think about an attachment between a 9-month-old and a parent without really invoking and explicitly describing the emotional processes that make up that attachment. It's hard to think about the transitions in life without thinking about the wonder of awe or the power of compassion or the laughter that unites friends. You'll see that a lot of my work, and this is sort of a synopsis of 25 years, is really on the nature of human emotional expression, which really began with Charles Darwin, and then was sort of brought into the future or the present by a Bay Area scientist, once with a Berkeley connection, Paul Ekman. And expressions, and I'll sort of walk you through what we've learned and how it shaped things from inside out to emoji to other manifestations of this. The emotional realm of expression in the voice and the body and the face helps us solve one of the hardest problems that humans try to solve, which is, how do I know what's in the mind of another person? And I think that they bring us right into the human mind. And then, with respect to being here in a museum, I grew up in museums. It is such a privilege to give this talk in a museum. I'm going to make the case in indirect fashion, and I think that there's increasing evolutionary evidence about this, that art, and let's remember, art is old. There are early body painting that took place 80,000 years ago. There are early musical instruments that are 30,000 years old. This is an organic process, an organic institution that grew out of something. And I'm going to offer the rather intuitive idea that it really is the transformation of raw emotion. I put these photos up because they speak to what Shannon talked about, which is that we are an assembling social species. We are the most social species that has ever walked the face of the earth. It is the defining shift in our evolution. It's important to remember that we've been evolving as this particular primate for 200,000 years, being crafted into, as Shannon eloquently said, a species that cares, that really finds extraordinary beauty and awe in the world. And that really has been the challenge of our lab's work, is to try to figure out the emotional correlates of those things. So now what I'd like to do is to tell you 4 different stories about how this science of emotion that I've been part of led me into places that, I would love to have been. I'd love to be a movie director. In fact, I'd give up my scientific career and part of my frontal lobes to be a movie director, but I was never very good in writing. But the science got me there, and as Shannon is urging us, there is this ever-increasing dialogue between science and the creative arts that I think you'll see really taking shape, in particular here in the Bay Area. So the first story has to do with this fellow, who's Pete Dacher, a dear friend, movie director over at Pixar, and the story of Inside Out. Pete, I had known Pete in friendly contexts, and we've been on a couple of panels together. He did the movie Up. Have you guys seen the movie Up? I agree, but I'll explain what that sound is in just a minute, which is not random that you did that sound. And Pete's talents in storytelling are extraordinary, and I'd always been a fan of, in particular, his work. So he calls me up one day, and he's like, "Hey, Dak, this is Pete." I'm like, "Pete?" He's like, "So I'm thinking about doing a movie that might be relevant to you." And I was like, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he's like, "I'd like to kind of do a movie about emotions." And I was like, "Great, I've been studying emotions. I got a couple drawings I want to pitch to you, by the way." So, and it's really about what I think to be the essence of emotion. And Pete actually had read this textbook that I had written and been tracking the science of emotion pretty with passion. And he said, what I really think the essence of emotions is, and what I really want to capture, and I don't think science has captured this, is that emotions are both inside and outside at the same time, simultaneously. And he said, what I'd like to do is to portray how emotions guide the thought processes and the forms of rationality in a human being. And it's like, there's a lot of science on that. And then I'd like to also show how at that same instant in time, and I think this is the magic of the emotions, they structure our social interactions instantaneously, the inside out of human emotions. I was like, God, there's so much science here, Pete. I'm very welcome to help out. And he said, and he actually made this movie because he was watching his 11-year-old daughter go through some emotional turmoil. And he said, and I'd like to make it about an 11-year-old girl who's going through some turmoil. Well, I was a father of an 11-year-old girl at the time, and I was like, Pete, I'll call you back in 5 years. Good luck. It was such a fascinating experience because, I visited Pixar every 6 months. Pete would call a lot. We had beers. I gave scientific presentations to different teams, and got to see behind the scenes how they animate things and how they create, and was part of a really interesting conversation that they had. It was a pivotal moment in the film, and I was talking to the Berkeley undergrads about this, where they wanted the film's central character to be about fear, and Pete really wanted it to be about sadness. And I think that was the critical decision in the film that in part was informed by a lot of science, which I'll get to. Let me just show you an interesting example of how science is going to play a part in this film, and I'll show you a couple of specific scenes that this is relevant to. And then at the same time, art will very arrogantly ignore science in spite of all the data and all the stuff that we try to prove people with. So the first question Pete asked me is, well, you know, Dacher, how many emotions are there? And I was like, oh, man, I got an answer. So I'm going to show you an answer. And so let me just show you. Get ready. I may need my glasses for this. So bear with me, because this is worth the wait. So in the scientific literature, we believe, after thousands of studies, that there are about 20 different emotional states that have been crafted by evolution. For those of you who are computationally inclined, and I know we have some computer scientists or computational students in the room, this is new work by Alan Cowan in our lab at Berkeley. He gathered 1,500 little sounds that communicate emotion. He gathered a bunch of data on each sound. And then with really cool mathematical and visualization techniques, he plots a map of human emotion. And he's doing this with music and painting and another stimulus set that I'll show you. So this is the space of emotion that we think exists as science, right? There are 20 different states. They have this interesting coloration and array. Let me show you what this sounds like as we move through this. So we're going to go from awe to surprise to fear. Wow. All right, now let's go from pain. Let's go from something the Trump administration is feeling tonight, disgust, anger, to pain. And then, of course, you're going to want to see some laughter. All right, here's another map. And I could go on with these all night, as my family knows. But you have to see, we're going to move from admiration to joy to admiration, joy, adoration, and amusement. These are GIFs, same procedure. Aww. Watch it. And then we get it. Things start getting funny. I can't remember what this one is. Okay, I could just go on all night. We don't even need to see other stuff. So I told Pete, I said, you know, Pete, there's a scientific basis for 20 different emotions. And he looked at me as if I was crazy. And he said, Dacher, you know, a clean narrative with a through line, you can't have 20 people bumping into each other, mixing it up. Of course, and so there were 6 emotions, so, or 5 in his character. So let me tell you about a couple of ways in which the science of human emotion was very relevant to the film. And in fact, I think in this case, there is no scientific study that could capture what art captured in this film. One of the things that we know from the scientific literature that we work on in our Berkeley lab and elsewhere is your identity is emotional, right? It is founded in this rich profile of emotions that you're born with, that begin in the womb, that are crafted by the genetics and the environment that you live in. My lab is obsessed with the vagus nerve, which is the largest bundle of nerves in your nervous system. It helps you look at people in the eye, vocalize, it slows your heart rate, it controls your digestion. We are finding, replicated about 15 times, that high vagus nerve function maps onto kindness and compassion and sharing and empathy, even down to the genetic level. What that means is that this is a kind of a identity-related physiological structure that shapes your emotional identity. And these are some of the social outside influences of this temperamental tendency. People who are more compassionate or have elevated vagal tone read emotions more accurately. They share and volunteer more. They handle trauma better. They have richer social ties. They see the past and the present through this emotional lens. And if you will ask them what their past was like, it will be filled with themes of kindness and beauty and connection. Just to further persuade you of this, we did a funny study at UC Berkeley. We coded the facial expressions of women graduated from college in 1958 from Mills College. This is a study by Ravenna Helson. It's the longest study of women's lives ever conducted. We just coded a couple of muscle movements. This woman got a high score because of the orbicularis oculi around the eye and the zygomatic major that pulls the lip corners up. This woman didn't get quite as high a score, and you can kind of see it in her face. And what these data show is this thesis that your identity is emotional, which is the warmer you were in your smile, the more that there was that twinkle in the eyes because of one muscle contraction. These are correlations. 30 years later, at age 52, the woman is feeling more competent, connected to others, achieving her goals, feeling like she has a lot of warmth and love around her, and feeling more happy with life. Our identity is emotional. And what happens as Pete got wind of this science as he was making Inside Out is that becomes a central thesis in the film in some of the more poignant scenes. Analytically, the emotions drive what's inside of her head. There's no rational control panel that's subverting the emotions. Even more poignantly, there are these amazing scenes that you may remember where joy starts to be influenced by sadness, the hero of the film, and her past becomes blue, right? She starts to look upon past experiences in her life through the color and lens of sadness. Another little influence of the science on this film. My lab, as Shannon said, has been really interested in the deep roots of compassion and sympathy. It is an interesting historical fact. Evolutionary scientists had a lot of trouble making sense of how good we are to other people, how 18-month-olds will help a stranger in need, how routinely we cooperate, how if we make fast decisions to share resources, we will share more than if we make slower, more rational decisions. And it had trouble making sense of the deep roots of how kind we can be. Charles Darwin digressed from that view. As I write about in Born to Be Good, Darwin, a devoted father, after watching his daughter, his second child die, his beloved daughter Annie, who he nursed to her death at age 12, said that sympathy is the human's strongest instinct because communities with the most sympathetic members will flourish and raise the greatest number of offsprings. Sympathy is rooted in the mammalian nervous system. These are great apes who have lost offspring and they're grieving. If you go see the Jane Goodall movie, you'll see Flo carry around Flint on her back, or carry around, you'll see this kind of grieving. What's even more remarkable is other great apes nearby will vocalize sympathy to the great ape who's lost a child. Right? They will send out these little sounds that say, I feel sorry for your suffering. So I'm going to test this room full of great apes. And I'm going to point to an emotion, and I want you to give me your best sound. And then you're going to see how this shaped a particular scene in Inside Out. So just to get you warmed up, here's a sound that I used to hear from my teenage daughters when they were 13 years old. My daughter Fina is now much beyond this particular sound. See if you know what emotion this is. What is that? I even like the tone of voice you use, right? All right, let's start at the top. 1, 2, 3, give me your best interest sound. Next one. Next one. Nice. I think wait a minute, let's back up. Let's go back to contentment. I heard a variety of different sounds on contentment. Some of you are like, ice cream. Contentment? Nice. It's interesting. A a lot of the great traditions have a spiritual sound, Om, and so a lot of greeting gestures in Hinduism and Buddhism have Om built into it, and it's got to be emerging out of this particular vocabulary that's very old. These sounds predate language. There are about 7 or 8 that are analogous or homologous in other species. This graph shows that when we play those sounds to people all over the world, from India to Pakistan to Bhutan, and we have them guess what emotion they just heard, the dotted line, you can see people are doing very well identifying this very rich vocabulary of emotion-related sounds. They're the foundation of how we communicate our interior states to other people. Now it gets interesting artistically. Hunter-gatherer societies, a lot of their dramatic performances are call-out performances where they take sounds of emotion and then dramatize them and build out little performative acts around them. Like a grief sound will become the foundation of a performance of a tragedy, right? There's this fascinating theory. It's one of the best theories on how emotion is transformed into aesthetic experiences. It's the Nacha Shastra, which is 1,500, 1,700 years old, and it's a Hindu text. And their idea, and we still haven't gotten there scientifically, is that you have these performances of one set of passions that are the human passions, and then you have, as an observer, this other set of passions where you are in an egoless state and you're appreciating aesthetically the emotion that you're perceiving. Starts to make sense of a slight paradox of how can we feel delight and joy when we see tragedies and tragic performances. Just draw your attention. So when people express sorrow, we as observers feel compassion. One of my favorite scenes, just to close out this story, was what led to this reunion scene in Inside Out. You know, one of the great things about Inside Out, as I love my Berkeley undergrads, I had this undergrad who was a veteran, had had a lot of trouble in his life. Now he's at UC Berkeley on his way to med school. When I asked my class, what did you get? It was just out. What did you think of Inside Out? He always raised his hand first. He's like, I was like, what, Michael? He's like, man, that was the darkest movie I've ever seen. Yeah. And he's right. As you might remember, there were temper tantrums and running away. And then at this reunion, the family gets together. And if you watch the movie carefully, you'll see her vocalize, just as you did, a little sigh of reunion that is right at the heart of that. So what we know, closing out the Pixar story, is, and this is where art and science and design are really starting to come together, is that the brain does really interesting things when we represent stimuli that are aesthetic stimuli. And this is just a brain representation of how we process emotional stimuli in art. And the critical things to note with this picture is that art engages the prefrontal cortex, which helps us make sense of and sort of narrate particular experiences. And then very interestingly, it also engages the nucleus accumbens, which is on the right-hand side, that NAC, which is the reward circuitry. So we're deriving pleasures from perceiving tragedy in art. Really interesting neuroscience. Story number 2 is, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions about, is Facebook a good thing or a bad thing? And I think the science has an interesting answer to that, and that Facebook probably doesn't like, but that's neither here nor there. So 6 years ago, I was brought into Facebook with a little Berkeley team, part at the Greater Good Science Center, and they really, you know, the platform, when I asked Pete Dacher, like, hey, Facebook wants to make the platform more human and kind, he's like, they need a lot of help, you know. And they wanted us to help kind of make the site try to approximate, and just think about the challenge, right, which is that we have been evolving communication systems and big chunks of the brain for tens of millions of years that help us feel connected and part of a community. And it really is face-to-face and skin-to-skin and eye-to-eye and vocal. It's all the multiple modalities that we're beginning to understand tonight. And now you have a digital platform with impoverished qualities that's trying to get close to what we do face-to-face. And obviously you know what I think about that. And one of the problems that they had, but they were locked in for arbitrary design reasons, is that was the main way you could communicate like you feel for somebody. And it was absurd. And we walked in and it was like, you know, we would hear stories of, you know, well, I have this sacred relationship to my grandmother, and she was close to me, and she taught me my philosophy of life, and now she's passed away. And people are like, it just was an act of absurdity. I was like, I've got a lot of ideas. Let's start over, okay? But this leads to a funny story. In the scientific literature, we're increasingly arriving at this idea of what we call Emo Diversity, which was named by a Berkeley undergrad, who I can tell you interesting stories about. And the idea is really, it traces back to Aristotle, who really felt that we need all of the passions to live a full life. Not just joy and gratitude and awe, which I'll talk about, but also sadness and anger and fear and pain and disgust. And that has sound evolutionary foundations for it. For Aristotle, we need all of the emotions at the right time, at the right place, toward the right people, toward the right end. And that really is virtue, is sort of cultivating our passions toward the right context and to the right degree. We need them all. So let me tell you what happened at Facebook, and it's kind of a funny story. I work on emotional signaling within this great tradition of Charles Darwin, who I've already alluded to. There he is. And he wrote still the best book on human emotion in 1872. It is the best description of human emotion that any human being has ever offered. It would blow you away, the kaleidoscopic detail of that book. My mentor, Paul Ekman, traveled to New Guinea and started to establish that 6 emotions were universal, and those indeed proved to be seminal and inside out. My lab has painstakingly, in obscurity and to mind-numbing detail, described about 20 different states, and you've already seen sort of the vocal data, the facial expression data, and I won't bore you with all the details of the 20 different emotions that exist. I didn't need to do this science. We all know this. These are some photos I took of some kids at a summer camp. I said, these are like 9 or 10-year-old kids before the sexual hormones are really starting to fill their bloodstream. And I was like, I was studying love and desire at the time, and I'm like, what the heck, let's try it out on these guys. So I was like, what do you think love looks like? And so that's my dear friend Austin over there. He's got a little Broadway in his display, as you can see. You see the young girl. Girls are always better at love, and she starts opening her hands and tilting her head in this charming way. And then there's that guy right there. I was like, Ashton, what's love look like? He's like, hey, 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 hey. I was like, I'm going to write your parents, and you stay away from my daughter. So, because you are in trouble, and I'll bet you he's in, anyway. So to help Facebook out, this is just one example. We gave Charles Darwin's descriptions of 41 different emotions in their just absolute striking detail. One of my favorites is he observes that when you get embarrassed, people often cough, even though they're not sick. Anyway, so are my pants down? You know, why do you think they do that? To distract? By time? Actually, you see it in a lot of different species. We show sickness and illness to elicit the sympathy of other beings around us, right? Birds will fake a broken wing to kind of pacify others, and we cough to try to beg forgiveness. So I gave these descriptions. This was at about the same time as I was working at Pixar, to one of my favorite illustrators over at Pixar. You should definitely check out his work. He's since left, who is Matt Jones, and there he is. Matt, these are some drawings. I took Matt. Matt and I went to an Iggy Pop concert. And he sat at the sidelines and drew a bunch of drawings of Iggy Pop performing. And then this is what he produced to capture Darwin's, these are called Darwin's emoji. And he just started drawing free form. And he starts to capture different states, like, don't you love that admiration display up there? Happiness, cheerfulness. These turned into 16 emoji that were released at Facebook. And you can see that they're more nuanced than the usual emoji. And I could tell you, I've become kind of I didn't want to be, but I'm now an emoji psychologist. So, you know, there's awe up there, which we'll talk about, and anger. And if you're feeling kind of flirtatious, you show that koi display. For some of you in the audience that may be in a couple of decades. There's sympathy and disgust and love. And then, now it gets really interesting. That was fun, and these were wildly successful. So we then released these on Facebook, and billions have been sent since then. We sneaked in and captured some data, and then hundreds of millions of emoji sent worldwide of these finch. And this allowed us to get a artistically derived picture of the emotional quality of countries around the world. And so what I'm going to show you is a map of the world. The redder the country, the more they're sending the particular emotion. The yellower the country, the less they're sending the particular emotion. Let's take a look. Here's anger. And we all know those Australians fight all the time, and there they are. Even more telling is compassion and sympathy. All you have to do is walk across the border between the US and Canada, and they become profoundly compassionate. So there we go. Very interesting. But what we found, the wider the array of emotions that you use, actually at the big data level, each dot represents a country. The more you express emotion and the more diversity of the expression, you can correlate it with life expectancy in the particular culture while controlling for things. All right. Two last stories, and then we'll think about the Empathetic Museum. And these move out of the realm of art to a certain extent and move into the realm of institutions outside of the art museum. As Shannon said, our lab and some of the students in here have been very interested in awe and this really interesting emotion that really had not been studied scientifically. And we just didn't know much about the feeling of being around vast things that transform or transcend your frame of reference that you don't understand. And I had the chance in thinking about the lives of people who are disconnected from institutions. We have a lot of those kinds of groups in the United States, from veterans to inner city kids, to think about redesigning awe into their lives. And I'll tell you about that experiment in a second. Awe is, all emotions have not only evolutionary stories, but they also have cultural stories, and they have histories that are thousands of years old. And awe is one of the real striking ones. The Greeks really thought it was, Protagoras, the Greek philosopher, really felt that awe was our signature strength, that our capacity to wonder and to marvel at the world and to think of things that are bigger than the self really is the engine of human culture. And I think they're onto something. There is an amazing book by a philosopher about how Newton and Descartes were trying to figure out how in the world do you see rainbows, right? What is the math and the geometry that goes into perceiving a rainbow and the angles by which light reflects upon the retina? And wonder really, and confusion really drove those scientific discoveries. And I think that's true of a lot of different scientific discoveries. Interestingly, awe and wonder become, and I can use this language perhaps, co-opted by religion. Obviously, awe is much earlier in our history, but it becomes a religious emotion 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, like Paul on his road to the Damascus and the conversion stories that you see in a lot of the religions. And then it has this incredible transformation from a likely source and an unlikely source. And the unlikely source is Edmund Burke, who was an old-time conservative and an opponent of the French Revolution and a very interesting conservative philosopher. But in this age of enlightenment, he secularized awe, like what was happening in a lot of different ways in the era of enlightenment when we were thinking about measuring things and science was arriving. And we're moving out of dogma to evidence and data and proof. And he really felt that awe was about big things you don't understand. And then, of course, the big transformation for American awe is Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he starts to write about the transformative power of nature. And I think I have a quote for you, which I'll read to you. Now, strikingly, if you are just a Berkeley denizen and you live life, awe comes from many different sources, and this is going to be important to us. You can get it in a cathedral. You can read great people. You can go to Bhutan, go up to the tiger's nest, which my dear friend Leif and I did. And that's you could see Chichen Itza. There's the real free speech that we should all be proud of. That is a truly awesome revolution. And then, of course, who could forget Iggy Pop, who's down there at the bottom. And tell me that's not an awesome body at 66. So we're gradually going to make the case in the lab that awe is how we fold into social collectives. And it is one of the great healers, as I'll show you. This quote starts to animate a lot of the science that I'm about to talk to you about. Ralph Waldo Emerson, "In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace or calamity that nature cannot repair." How many of you felt repaired by being near a tree? I mean, try to psychologize that. That is a spectacular process. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. And one of the things that evolutionary, computational, behavioral economic scientists are grappling with and starting to get some answers to is we need a variety of different devices that shut down egotism, that quiet self-interest and orient us towards other people. I think the emotions do a lot of that work, and awe is one of them. So just to give you sort of a rationale for what's about to come, we've surveyed 26 different countries around the world, every different religion and degree of economic development. This is a specific study that looks at China and the United States. We surveyed every day. We had them tell us about an awe experience. People feel awe about twice a week. And I think once you really dive into it, that feels right. Very interestingly, and this my students confirmed when they traveled to study the Himba, who are remote people in Namibia, which is most of our awe comes at the wonderment we feel about other people, right? The magic of babies. Childbirth is a very common elicitor of awe around the world. You know, the magnanimity of people, how they share, how courageous people are. So that's represented in this pie chart. Nature turns out to be the second big source of awe around the world. And I can't help but point out one finding that caught us by surprise. In the United States, 9% of the time, people say that they are the source of their own awe. They're like, awe? Man, I told this joke at the happy hour last night. It was incredible. I'm awesome, right? That never happened in China. So that's what's wrong with us. So just to give you a feel of what we do, we've done all kinds of fun. This is what, you know, we first tried to produce awe in the lab. That was numbskull. That was about 3 years of failures. Like, look at this big video of fractals. And they're like, you know. So we started to do the real thing. So in one study, our undergrads look up into these beautiful eucalyptus trees on UC Berkeley's campus. They're spectacular. Or they looked up at a science building. And then what we find is just a minute of eucalyptus trees. Those students feel less self-important. They feel less entitled. They actually need less money to do the study. We pay them. They're like, I don't believe in money anymore. So, and they, like all social psychologists, there's all kinds of mischief in our study. We had a guy wipe out by the participant and drop a bunch of pens. And the person feeling awe in the green picked up more pens. now it gets really important. This is a picture of a system that we're really interested in our lab that's a little branch of your immune system called the cytokine system that releases proteins that attack pathogens in your body. And it produces the inflammation in your body. So if you cut your arm, the body swells up. It tries to keep it clean. It takes a lot of resources to attack that cut. If you get a flu and the virus is inside of you, the cytokine system gets hyperactivated, and your body's inflamed, and you're mucousy, and have a body, you're sluggish and feverish. There is amazing work I write about in the Power Paradox coming out of Northwestern that kids in poverty, by the time they're 5, have hyperactive inflammation responses. So their bodies always think they're being assaulted. And they act as if they have a flu. And when I moved to a really poor town when I was 10 years old, I felt like all the kids around me were sick all the time, right? They're mucousy and feverish and sluggish. And it's poverty that's doing that. So based on that, with Stacy Baer, who is the contemporary John Muir, you should Google him. He's one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. He was a veteran, was about to kill himself, like a lot of veterans who have the highest suicide rate of any demographic sector in the United States, and then discovered his soul rock climbing. And since then has been running the outdoors programs at the Sierra Club, where he gets 300,000 people outdoors, including about 15,000 veterans and tens of thousands of people from poor urban centers. But just by way of note, the national parks, hundreds of millions of people go to the national parks every year. And it's one of the few institutions where it's not, it is not class-based. It really appeals to everybody. South Korea has a tradition of healing forests where it's built into their healthcare system to go out into the woods and follow these paths and feel the leaves on your skin as a form of healing, with a lot of great data that support that. So we followed suit. We did this great study. Craig Anderson, Maria Monroy, I'm not sure if Maria's here. We actually took high school students out on rafting trips in the Sierras and also veterans. And here's a picture. They go for a day and a half. You can imagine what it's like to collect data on a raft. GoPro gave us a bunch of cameras. We have thousands of hours of photo data. We gathered saliva before and after the trip, giving them, a lot of these kids had never been camping and had never seen a sky full of stars at night. And that was one of the most staggering observations. So what we find, we've just published, just literally in the last day or two, one paper, the others are coming out. These are high school kids, less stressed after the trip, feeling more social well-being vis-a-vis their parents and friends, happier with life. In our sample of veterans, after a day on the river, we see a 30% drop in PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder. That is very hard to approximate in any kind of intervention, is the power of nature. So my final story is one that I, again, thanks to this science, got invited into. And John Tiger's here, a dear friend, and he and I had this experience together, which has to do with solitary confinement. We're one of the only industrialized countries that puts people into solitary confinement. As many of you may not know, although Susie knows, who's my sister-in-law, that is almost a default treatment when adolescents go into the criminal justice system. They'll throw them into solitary confinement. I was reading The New Yorker, and has anybody read the Atul Gawande essay on solitary confinement? It is spectacular. It changed my life. And basically, what he was saying is it drives you crazy. And it's the antithesis of assembly, right? So this is from Pelican Bay, which will figure prominently in the story I'm about to tell you. On the right is the cell. where you don't get to be around people. You're in there 23 hours a day. That's what it looks like. You have no access to sky or windows or anything. For an hour a day, you get to go to an exercise yard, and that's the exercise yard in Pelican Bay. And that is a very fog-bound part of California where it's full of black mildew and mold, and it is a disaster. And that's what they get for their lives in solitary confinement. And here is the hero of the story, very unlikely hero, who is Todd Ashker, who was a white supremacist. And he and 3 other gang leaders, what they do in a lot of maximum security prisons is just arbitrarily a correction officer will point to a guy and say, you're in solitary confinement. That's it. No due process or judgment or committee. They're in, and they're in for 20 years. And Todd Ashker was in solitary confinement. You don't get to see the human face. You barely get to hear people. And he started to communicate. They put, 20 years ago, the gang leaders of the major gangs at Pelican Bay into solitary confinement. And there were certain moments in the day where they could communicate with each other. And they started to describe the horrors and that this was impossible. Then he decided to initiate a food strike. And I've subsequently learned on visits to San Quentin that they can't communicate with the outside world. But they started to spread the word, and they were spreading the word through little political messages that they were hiding in brooms. So a guy would come sweeping through an alleyway or a hallway and pass a message to the other inmates. And they had a hunger strike, nation's largest hunger strike of 30,000 people. That led to this interesting case where the Center of Constitutional Rights was going to charge Governor Brown for cruel and unusual punishment, that this violates that principle. And they initiated a lawsuit, and they brought me in, and I got to review the process of what it's like to be in these maximum security prisons. And one of the things that they fundamentally disallow is touch. And the science of touch, and it's so interesting that we forget this, but the science of touch, the human hand, is a spectacular wonder of 5 digits. A couple of genes helped develop it into this amazing instrument wherein we built tools, right? We learned how to communicate. There's a lot of speculation that the origins of language begin in gesture, in the way that we use our hand to represent semantics. When we touch the skin is 6 to 8 pounds, billions of cells. Your immune system's in the skin. It sends signals that we still barely understand to big chunks of your brain and your cortex that are designed to represent what's happening in your skin. This is one of the most sophisticated communication systems that evolution has ever produced, right? It's the first system that is online when you're born. It is the foundation of social life. We know scientifically, if I just pat you on the back, reward circuits of your brain are activated. People become more collaborative and cooperative just by an incidental pat on the back. Kids and individuals feel safer when they're patted on the back. There's a great study from France where when school kids are patted on the back by the teacher, they don't even know they've been patted on the back. They're 3 to 5 times more likely to try to do problems on the board. And touch calms the stress response in the body. There's a lot of data from healthcare settings showing that that is a very immediate effect upon cortisol and the amygdala and stress regions of your nervous system. Touch, of course, my wife Molly helped me with this, has a it's interesting. We don't think about it, but it's everywhere in art. Caravaggio was very radical for that very human portrayal of the Madonna and Child. I like, Renoir for all his corniness. There's a lot of great touch in that famous painting that once you start to look at it, you're like, oh, that's where a lot of the psychological meaning is, of people leaning in and arms on shoulders and the like. So I got into this case because we did this funny study at Berkeley, brought 2 people to the lab. It's almost like a piece of performance art where you come to the lab, there's a barrier in the lab, you stick your arm through the barrier, someone else comes in, they try to communicate emotions by touching the arm over there. You have to guess what emotion just got communicated. The blue bars, chance guessing is 8.33%. The blue bars show you we're 6 or 7 times better than chance at picking up compassion, gratitude, and love with a little quarter-second touch to your arm from a stranger. Regrettably, when women try to communicate anger to a man by touch, he got nothing right. He had no idea what she was doing. And when the man tried to communicate compassion to the woman, she had no idea what he was doing and felt like it was a robot. Those are replicated findings. So I became part of this team led by Craig Haney down at UC Santa Cruz. It's so interesting where science is not allowed, and it's not allowed in our prisons. They don't let you study what's going on, which is, I've tried several times. And these are just some data from interviews that after solitary confinement, the likelihood of a nervous breakdown is 70%, 27% suicidal ideation. And then one of the real common effects is psychosis, where after a short period in solitary confinement, you hallucinate. I'm happy to report once we marshaled all this new scientific data, brain effects, clinical effects, tactile effects, when families visit prisoners at Pelican Bay, they are not allowed to touch their dads. Kids are not allowed to touch their dads. It was astonishing. And so Ashker versus Brown, if you're interested, was the case. They settled. 2,500 prisoners got out of solitary confinement. So that was very gratifying to see the science informed. So Shannon challenged me to talk about assembly, reassembly, museums. And I'll just tell you some obvious stuff, and then I'm going to raise some issues that we can all talk about in the Q&A in a couple of minutes. I was lucky enough, my dad's an artist. My mom is pretty much an artist. My wife's an artist. My daughters are becoming artists. I'm surrounded by artists. So that's why I do science. But I was lucky to grow up in museums. And I can honestly say, forgive these horrible images, but when I encountered the Dutch masters, De Hoek and Jan Steen, and looked at how they portrayed emotion, I was like, I'll never do that scientifically, but I see what they're after, and that informed me. The photography of the disenfranchised, this series I saw as a young man, and it really opened my mind and heart. I do a lot of research on poverty and social class that is ever more relevant today, and museums, and I will never approximate. And I remember we were publishing these scientific studies about how people who are poor feel more compassion and empathy for other people. And we replicated that a dozen times and got a lot of flack from economists in wealthier countries. And we're like, take this. So, and here's Goldberg's has this great series of the rich and poor, and this photo blew me away. And there's the phrase, poverty sucks, but it brings us closer together. And science could never approximate that. And then, of course, museums are a place for surprising experiences of the sublime. I used to go to the La Brea tar pits near the LA County Museum. And I loved art, but I'd seen a lot of art in my life. But what I really loved was the tar pits and the saber-toothed tigers and the woolly mammoths dying, and this early introduction into evolution, which is very, very lasting for me. So let me tell you, I'm now part of a really interesting conversation with various museums, including the LA County Museum, about how do we make museums more empathetic. And these are some of the questions that are really emerging that are unanswered and I bet you have some wisdom about this. Do we want, you know, it's interesting. I believe that we evolved to appreciate beauty, that the early forms of artistic experience and appreciation were in emotion, that we want to touch it and take it in and put it next to our skin. So how do you engage more immersive experiences? It's almost a paradox of a museum that there's so much distance there, right? That the objects are out there and you want to hold them and, you know, put them into your mouth if you're 18 months old or whatever it is. So how do we do that? There are going to be interesting conversations about virtual reality art. What would it be like if I projected into the Dutch masters? And I'm like, whoa, you know, I'm in a Vermeer, you know, and there she is, you know. All mayhem will, I think we should really be worried about class divides. A lot of the debates right now about college campuses are revealing that institutions, whether they like it or not, when they have columns and names and white marble and old objects that typically came from a particular class, it's hard to connect to them if you're from a different class background. So I think we've got to work on that in a very assertive way. And then I think, and this was interesting in this, I was just at this media conference this weekend, how do we represent bottom-up art? There is enormous amounts of art happening online right now. YouTube has 1 billion videos worldwide loaded every day, right? A lot of the stuff that people are producing, Snapchats and Vimeos and YouTube, is really interesting. And it's outside of the canon. It's produced by people. It's democratized. So what do we do with that? How can we represent that? So I'll leave you with 2 things. This is a quote from my mom, who, when she heard I was interested in this stuff, this really sums it all up, by Percy Shelley. The great secret of morals is love, or going out of our own nature, an identification of ourselves with the beautiful that exists in thought, action, or person not our own. And I still marvel at the fact that the human mind can be awestruck and find absolute stunning beauty in other things than the self. And that really is one of the foundational developments in our evolution. And then I am at the Greater Good Science Center, if you're interested in that. Those are my 2 recent books. And I want to thank you for your attention. So I think Shannon and I are going to sit up here and have a Q&A with lots of cues from you.
Dacher, thank you so much for an incredibly inspiring and so many different types of examples here, which is maybe behind my first question while you're all thinking up yours. We've talked about art as one noun, kind of, yeah, and I'm sort of interested in the arts, in a range of arts, and you actually haven't been involved in a range of things that travel under this term art. Film or museums, or my point of entry to the arts, I'll just let this piece of paper go, is actually from the performing arts. So we deal in empathy and management of emotion all the time. And then it's different, I think, to then enter the museum to sort of think about how is our emotions managed there. So just, yeah, various art forms. What's your take now on your research in relationship to a variety of art forms?
Yeah. So there are 2 things to be thinking about. One is that, you know, music, and we're starting to work, we've got some music maps. Email me, I'll send you our music maps. There is thinking and pretty good data out in the literature that the human voice and how we communicated emotion, the particular acoustic features of the human voice,
map onto how we express emotion with different instruments, and that should be intuitive to all of you. That sad music sounds like a sad vocalization, tends to mirror its patterns. It's really interesting to think about dance, and I know, and the Nacha Shastra, which is this 1800-year-old text, has this whole performative art or aesthetics of dance that if you travel through India, you will see performed, and then there are variations or relatives of that in Indonesia. And again, it's the same idea that there are these basic human forms by which we express it in art, and they're kind of the basic forms of how we are physical with emotion. The broader question that you're raising, and I think the new generation is going to have to push this hard, which is that, we have, obviously, and I suspect you would align with this, which is there's art everywhere, right? And the US often confines it in museums. If you go to Europe, it's more in public spaces. But you just can't help it organically showing up. And I think that's where the new technologies could be really interesting and useful, is to think about portals into art that's taking place on a street corner, or art that is taking place amongst kids that are building things in a park. So I think we need to, I think part of the reimagining is to really think outside of the museum context for a lot of reasons.
Right, or to allow the museum to change itself, or to encourage the museum to change itself and change what it thinks its boundaries are.
And one of the neat ideas,
Go.
Probably only thought about this, that happened this weekend is, just like we have pop-up restaurants, why don't museums have pop-up experiences, right? So that the kid who's out in rural California, where I grew up, who never gets to see a museum, pow, you pop it up. And I think there are a lot of ways to enable that.
So maybe I'll just ask a couple of other questions, and then we'll go to the floor. I also think about what the role of different, we'll say, artistic assembly spaces, art events of different sorts, might be in, I don't know, exercising the muscles of emotion, of emotional expansiveness. You put up the Poetics, you put up Aristotle, who was really preoccupied with emotional, you could say, development, but the right emotional development. Now we maybe have less tolerance for deciding what's a right emotion or not, but still that same notion that the arts are a place to, in a sort of safe, relatively safe space, to try on a range of emotions. And I don't know, I wonder about that part too, the safety part, before you get back into reality.
Yeah, one of the, I think that what happens in a lot of aesthetic exercises like beauty and humor and those kinds of operations of the human mind is we signal, there are parts of the brain, and that's why I showed that brain image where we say, this is safe, right? This is exploratory. You can make mistakes here. And it was interesting. We were with the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They have 900,000 people go through their museum, right? The scale of this opportunity is huge. And we started asking people, like, what were their fundamental experiences, their first experiences of being in a museum? And what they talked about was being safe and finding new facets to the identity. So I think that's going to be a critical part of the endeavor.
That you can't repress that, cultivate that, and in theaters, and in cinemas, and lots of places. I think it was interesting that here at the end you were thinking about a lot of, I don't know, it felt that a lot of what museums are thinking about to encourage participation, to encourage democracy, I feel were sort of differently framed by your talk, by having a kind of rigorous analysis of emotion. It kind of, there's a lot of museums who are working on VR. A lot of theaters are working on VR right now. In fact, the meeting that preceded my introduction of this event was a meeting about virtual reality across all of the arts and design spaces. It's definitely circulating all throughout our campus. People are working on it. And now I feel even more clear, though, about the necessity of making sure that that's not just next gizmo. Look what we can do.
Yeah.
And to try to think about what really core values we might have a chance of exercising and refining through augmented reality and virtual reality.
Yeah, I'm actually skeptical about virtual reality,
Uh-huh.
and having seen Oculus down at Facebook, and I think that there's no substitute for being next to a person.
That's the issue.
Yeah,
I feel like
I agree.
I feel very lonely
Yeah.
in virtual reality environments.
And it's absurd. You put on this
Yeah.
giant mask, and you're like, okay, I'm experiencing things, and you're like,
Yeah.
no, you're not.
Yeah.
Or I don't know what you're experiencing. So
Yeah,
it may be the antithesis. And they're interesting, ironic. There's a little science that keeps finding like, it actually makes people feel more closed-minded. It's like, yeah.
I could have told you that. Okay, but I mean, it's going to happen though. So it is going to happen. So then, what I feel like we should be we should be helping lead.
See where it goes.
Yeah, lead where it goes. Okay. So as we're going back and forth amongst ourselves, I'm sure you guys are starting to form your own thoughts and questions. Anyone from the floor wanna? Yeah, there.
Hold on one moment.
Yeah, we're trying to record to. Yeah.
Thank you so much for.
Sorry, yeah. You got it. Yeah.
Thank you. Now you can hear me better. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about the art in the realm of psychology. I come from the personal experience of both being an internationally recognized music educator as well as the victim of emotional trauma through being on recipient end of the crisis around women-specific heart disease, #1 killer of women. My question to you, Professor, is what is the future of the intersection of psychology and expressive arts and the participatory arts and whatever creative expression you may use to formulate this
Yeah,
term?
it's so, the work with the Sierra Club, so a lot of countries are way ahead of us in using nature to heal people. And it's happening on a huge scale in the United States, and it's cheap. You get into a national park, it's $20. You are exposed to the wonders of the park, and it heals your body. And that is, there are 120 studies that lend credence to that claim, and we should be building that into our healthcare system and get paid to get out there and with specialized groups who have been traumatized. Veterans are an obvious group. And it's the same with the arts. And I was just looking at this last night, there are 10 or 12 studies with people who've experienced trauma, sexual trauma, wartime trauma. And just as you would imagine, if they're allowed to start to sort of represent it with music or get into visual arts, it helps them at a high level. And I think we just have to open up our mind to these are ways we heal the mind that are outside of my establishment of science, because they're there, and we know it intuitively, and the data are catching up. So it's good to keep that in mind as well.
Okay, lots of questions. Maybe we can pass a microphone to two people so we can take them in succession, one here and one there. Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful talk and this wonderful occasion. The question I had was another way of thinking about these things, the current times perhaps, is sort of pathos, ethos, logos. And if we think of logos as being, okay, that's going to automation, isn't pathos paying a lot of attention to individual emotions, sort of the opposite of what we want, because we actually just need something that brings us all together, which is the shared space. And some of the emotions you were talking about seem to exist in that shared, cultivating the ethos, the demos, that public shared thing again.
Yeah.
And some of them seem very still individual, and it's our best guess of what the other person's feeling. Maybe if they're rather different than us, we can't actually tell, or we don't pay any attention. So I worry about turning too much to individual emotion at a time when we seem to be overwhelmed by unbridgeable gulf.
Yeah, thank you, Karis.
Oh, sorry.
When Shannon and I talked about this talk, that's why we're all here. And it's so much better. It's so much better to see all of you out there than to be on a screen on a webinar, right? Who's been on a webinar? Yeah. And
Click reassembly.
and Karis is absolutely right, which is that humans, it's so interesting to make, and as you might imagine from my evolutionary perspective, how are our emotions really different from the great apes, from whom we diverged 7 million years ago? We still share 96% of our DNA. And one of them is collective, right? We mimic, we vibrate, we have effervescent emotion. Your physiology, we just, in a rafting paper, we found, we're just about to publish this paper, if you go out on a rafting trip and the person you're with is screaming their heads off because they have high stress hormones, by the end of the trip, your hormones are high too, and you're like, stop it, man, you know. So our emotions are shared, and that's where it gets transcendent and joyful and spiritual, and that's where the new technologies are failing, and they will never be able to approximate that. In fact, there are new data coming out showing they undermine that, and that's why tonight is very important, as you have urged us, is to reassemble. And I like the millennials. The millennials deserve much more praise than older people give them. And one of the things that they are doing is assembling in really novel, interesting ways. Like, do I have any millennials in the room? Very good. How many of you do game nights? Look at that, game nights. When I was game night, what's a game night? You know, they're getting out, playing board games, and assembling with emotion. So I agree, Karis. It's an important reminder. Technologies have to bring people together, otherwise they're missing the point.
And that the study of emotion is not only about individuals, and there can be this devolution immediately into that individuated therapeutic model. And what's so great about your work is that it's so other-directed.
Yeah.
Okay, there was a hand there, and then we'll go to this hand here. All right.
Thank you for the great, that's loud, presentation. As I was watching it, I was thinking about how I could see this exact same thing at home on my computer, and it would not be all the same experience, and how much we crave a group experience, like with movies, we all want to go there, watch collectively, or a play. But then we come to museums, and it seems like such a solitary experience, where everyone's like, you shouldn't even stand too close to someone else, or you would never talk about it. And do you have ideas about how that could be different?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. So this is my neighbor, too. But you were going to come anyway, I know. This is, well, I think we've actually been talking about this. I've been talking about this all weekend. We had a gathering over the weekend around the Arts of the Present, where Rudolph Freeling, who's a media art curator at SF MoMA, was talking about exactly this issue. This is the media art collector who has basically has a big soundtracks exhibition up, which I encourage you to see, which began with the recognition that the museum is a space of bodies and sounds already. and rather than sort of repressing and hiding and being quiet, et cetera, so you can hear this sound piece, he curated the space with the recognition that that was already the condition. And then in order to create a really different kind of experience than the one you're describing. And so you could say, on the one hand, I'm a performing arts person. I'm used to being with bodies on stage, in the room, can't get enough of them, et cetera. And then when I started to work more and more with museums, I also felt the same way, of like, I feel this strange isolation. And yet at the same time, museums are spaces of assembly. There are people gathered routinely, and it's really more about how to sort of change exhibition practices, et cetera, and our own perambulating through there so that we can actually recognize this as part of the medium of the experience and to curate for that. My colleague Natasha Boas, I don't know if she's here still, is also she's helping me teach a curation course across disciplines where we've been thinking about exactly that. And interestingly, my other co-teacher, Eric Siegel, director of the Botanic Garden, he suggests that it was science museums who got better at doing this first than the art museums, who got better at thinking about how to claim the collectivity of being together, and that we might need to catch up a bit more on the art museum. So sorry I took over on that one.
Well, I get to tell a little family story, which is because my daughter Fina is here. When we went to the Monterey Aquarium, another kind of museum, I forgot how old Fina was she 3 or 4? 3, we were like, so, I know this is horribly embarrassing, but it's revealing, which is, we're like, what did you think of the fish and the sharks and the rays? And she's like, the people were amazing, And people are amazing, and we have to figure out how to make that more visible.
That part of this experience. That's great. Yeah, thank you. Here, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful talk tonight. So my question kind of relates to the question you answered right before the last one, and it's more on the topic of like social media.
Yeah.
The Facebook case study was great, as giving people this way to express emotion a little bit better, right, than just and that's helpful.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, there's all the research that like the more time people spend on social media, like even though it's an interaction of a type, it often leaves people feeling more isolated or worse afterwards. And so I'm curious about two things. One is like, where do you think the line is in terms of participation? Like, what would be a healthy line in your estimation? And then also, do you think that we're better off as a society with this substitution for a more authentic face-to-face interaction, even though it's harder to arrange those things and at volume, certainly to compare with social networks? Those are my questions. Thank you so much.
Simple questions, huh? Yeah, thanks. I can give you, so the generic answer is, and we know this from social science, is like, you enjoy new social media if you're in control and you're a producer rather than a consumer of the content, and if you minimize and make it useful. And that's true of almost all technologies, is just make it useful. And that's documented in the literature, but the perils are very much aligning with what you're talking about. And when I began the work at Facebook 6 years ago, we were in this period of techno-optimism, right? And it was like, whoa, my daughters learned about Mike Brown through Snapchat before I even could get into the TV or on the internet, and we thought it was this kind of hyper-connectivity way to change the world. And I think that we've had there have been a couple of big wake-up calls. One is all the Facebook revolutions in the Middle East turned out to be just the opposite. And I have a postdoc who's working on how Facebook empties political movements of meaning, right? And so protest, and I think that I went to every free speech protest on the Berkeley campus, Milo Yiannopoulos and all the knuckleheads that came after, and it was nothing. It was ridiculous. It was 7 guys who were cranking out messages. There was a lot of swastikas, and that was upsetting for our staff, but as a political movement, it was inconsequential. So I think we got to grapple with that, and then also what you're talking about, which is I have a postdoc who has data showing of the 28 things that you could be doing right now that make you happy, being on Facebook ranks 26th. So it's a little bit better than getting a tooth pulled, or cleaning out the garbage can, but the rest beats it, including the dishes and homework. And so they've, and that's you're right. I mean, it's going to be, I think the new generation is going to resist, and a new movement will come out where it's like, oh, this is like a drug. I don't want it. And then they got to redesign. And I think there are opportunities for redesign. We'll see if they go for them.
Okay, there's there, and then we have one here. Yeah.
And you said sadly you couldn't do research in prisons, but I was wondering about research in corporations, because there is a certain amount of imprisonment that most people feel, certainly emotionally. Hello.
It's so funny. It's interesting. This has been an interesting experience for me, like how receptive people are to science.
Right.
You can't study prisoners, and you can't study CEOs.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just at a big national Women in Corporate America conference, and somebody won a big award for starting a well-being center in her corporation. And she got there by going through absolute burnout, working 20 hours a day, burning out, getting cancer, and realizing, oh, maybe life could be different. And she started this well-being program in her corporation. and has gotten a lot of support for it. And that, you know, often includes like meditation or working out or taking a nap or a day off or something. But I'm wondering about doing research around bringing arts, performing arts and visual arts and music, everything into the corporations, because we all know that it reduces stress. The less stressed people are, the healthier they are. So if we could make a nice, strong connection between art and profit, it would be awesome.
Yeah. And that already exists for national parks. Everywhere there's a national park, the city makes a lot of money. They're a great investment. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. There is a lot of this stuff moving into corporations and organizations. But then when you take a step back and you think about, you know, our happiness is intertwined with other people, corporations need to grapple with mass incarceration and inequality. And whatever happens, there's a critique of the happiness literature by Barbara Ehrenreich that it's, and ironically, even though I'm critiqued in the book, I agree with her, so that's problematic. But that, you know, this happiness stuff gotta spread out to everybody if it goes into a corporation. Otherwise, it's keeping this rise in inequality going. So I like the idea, but would press it further in that way.
Yeah. Who has the, is there, right there? Yeah, great, thank you. And then you can pass the microphone to another person.
Hi, you mentioned when you were talking about a sense of awe that most of the time, regardless, cross-culturally, people experience it through interpersonal communication, right?
Yeah.
What was it specific, like, did you ever do any research into what was it specifically in everyday human interaction that produces that kind of awe?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And it was really a surprise. You know, religion rates very low, even in really religious countries. So it's things like childbirth pops up a lot, watching infants, people's surprising generosity. Their reunions are like, people are blown away by unexpected reunions, right? Where you didn't expect the relative to be there, and she comes in and embraces the kids. So it's this interesting capacity we have to be wonderstruck by positive emotion or pro-social emotions in others. So those are sort of some of the examples. And then in other countries, like in China, it's a lot about, and for the teachers out there, this is going to bring tears to your eyes. They always talk about teachers, right? Oh, I know. I'm like, no one talks like that here, you know. It's like, I had this great teacher, and, you know, she taught me about this equation or whatever. So there's a little bit of cultural nuance to that. But it's just the capacities humans have. We didn't, and also underappreciated in the literature is how powerful babies and childbirth are. As that was certainly one of my big experiences while I was like, my wife was like, oh, that's easy for you to feel, but yeah. But I was like, oh my God, so.
Okay, maybe one more question? Or, okay, two more. Yes, okay, you got the mic.
Hi, it was a great lecture. As a foreigner, I have a couple of observations about, you know, the culture over here. And, you know, most of my observations are pretty much the opposite of what you just said on the, you know, on your lecture. So, for example, over here, you really like to give a lot of personal space, right?
Yeah.
Not to touch each other.
Yeah.
And not to really say what you really feel or mean, you know, like, if you know what I mean. So, you do. So, do you think it's a good idea to, you know, to develop this, let's say, culture? Is it, will it lead to a healthy culture or not to do this, you know?
Where are you from?
Israel.
Ah, nice. Yeah, much warmer. Yeah, you know, one of the, and it was so interesting, you know, a subtext of this talk is, I believe, evolution created an ideal community. It's a idealization, and it has a lot of art and music and song and emotional exchange and touch and play, and we resolve conflicts in peaceful ways and so forth. And there's a lot of, that's kind of one of the implications of an evolutionary perspective. And then what happens is cultures We're given this bundle of capacities, hundreds of them, and cultures are good at some, and they're not good at others. And the Greater Good Science Center takes a look at the United States like you do and says, we could be more cooperative, we could be less stressed out, we could be a little bit more mindful, we could share more. So how do you cultivate that? And I agree. I think one of the reasons I got really interested in touch is the Western European countries tend to be a little touch deprived, right? One of my favorite examples is a videotape study of friends talking to each other. And in England, one of the less happy countries in the world, they touch each other 0 times. In the US, twice. And in Puerto Rico, 110 times. In the same, and this is, aha! I get, are you going around hugging Americans and they're recoiling, or what's? Yeah, so we got.
Scared to do it,
So we got to figure out where we're weak and build it up.
Great. Was there a last question? Okay. Right in the middle, so take some effort to pass the microphone there. Thanks.
Thank you. So this is so fascinating to me, not just because I love BAMPFA and I love coming here, but also because my major, I study happiness. Like I'm an ISF major at Berkeley, and my practicum is called the Science, Cultivation, and Practice of Human Happiness. So this is like so cool, and I want to like work for you, and this is my dream. But my favorite part of the presentation was when y'all were talking about museums and how to make them more malleable for the experience. And have either of y'all or anyone in the room heard of the Color Factory at all?
Get in, can you?
Yeah, so I went to the Color Factory in September for my birthday, and that was probably the coolest thing I've ever done. It's this pop-up museum. Y'all were talking about pop-up museums. And it's pretty much Instagrammable, first and foremost, which I think is so fascinating. And it's just one long experience with color. And I like weeped through the process because it was so fun and beautiful, and it made me so happy. So I was thinking, have you thought about making it part of your focus or like study or program at the Science Center, like designing a student-led interactive museum at all? Like, would you be into that?
Yeah, we're,
I think
so
cool.
and that's part of why Shannon and I are talking. We're, right now, we're working with our computer science department, so computing for social good, and just encouraging those kinds of talents who know how to write code and do computational work to think about visually beautiful things that connect these themes into interactive spaces. And I think it'd be great to talk about that, and that's what Berkeley undergrad should be doing.
And I have a lot of things to say about the Color Factory that I won't say here. But I mean, all different kinds of things. I think there's so many provocative things that it has done by having that in the region, along with other things like new formats. But when it comes to Berkeley, I'll just say even right now, I'm co-teaching a big ideas course on curating across disciplines, across visual arts, across performing arts, design, science, and technology, that is utilizing and trying to reference all of the different places and ways that we curate across campus. That I have a sort of secret hope that's now less secret, to cultivate this as a stream or educational stream that really crosses the disciplines at Berkeley, that this could be one of many different kinds of discovery experiences that really utilize all different dimensions of the campus. And when we've started to look more and more into alumni who actually happen to be curators now, curators of many things at the Exploratorium, curators of the Bay Lights Project, curators of all different kinds of things. Some are art history majors and art majors. Many of them were ethnic studies majors, geography majors, politics majors, J-school grads. So it really is actually that Berkeley students who are connecting the dots across all of these different fields are actually even more perhaps expansively equipped, I think, to create creative formats for deep engagement across many knowledges and across cultures. So I think we have a real chance to build something even bigger around that theme. Yeah. All right, should we end there? Thank you, Doctor.
I want to be part of it.